Hi everyone, in this Blender tutorial I'm going to show you how to make this animation of a laser cutting a hole in the floor and then have the circle fall through. So let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is just press A to select all the objects, X and delete all. Then I'm going to press Shift A, select Mesh, and I'm going to add a ground plane. And then I'm just going to press S and I'm just going to scale it up. And let's just set the dimensions to 100 by 100 meters. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is to add an empty object. So Shift A, empty, plane axes. And this is going to be the target for our laser and for the source of the sparks that come out when the laser hits the ground plane. So everything is going to point towards this empty object. So I want to cut a circular hole in the floor, so I want this empty object to take a circular path. So I'm just going to go to the location for the X and Y, and I'm going to press hash, and I'm going to go sine of frame, and I'm going to divide it by, let's say 20, and press enter. And you can see that's added a driver to the X and Y location for my empty object here. And then if I just play the animation, you can see it starts moving back and forth. But if I want to take a circular path, I actually need to change the Y coordinate from sine to cos. And now you see if I restart the animation and play it, the empty object is taking a circular path of radius 1. And that looks pretty good. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is to add our mesh for our laser. So that's just going to be a cylindrical mesh. So I'm just going to press Shift A, Mesh, and Cylinder. And let's just press this button here. Let's just increase the number of vertices to, let's say, 50. I'm going to decrease the radius to something very, very small. Let's try 0.03 meters. And I'm just going to increase the depth a little bit. Let's just say, let's make that 3 meters. And now we've got a very thin laser. And just click anywhere to deselect. So we're going to want one end of the laser to be at a fixed point in the sky and the other end to point towards our empty object. So I'm just going to click on the laser here. Actually, it might be a little bit too long. Let's just reduce the dimensions in the Z. Let's make it 1.5 meters. And it's always good practice just to reset the scale on all your objects. You can see here I've got X, Y, Z. I've got scale 1, and scale 1/2. So let's just go Control A and press scale just to re-normalize all those scales. Okay, so we've got our laser sitting at the origin here, and you can see our empty objects orbiting around it at a distance of 0.5 meter. Sorry, 1 meter. So the total diameter of this is 2 meters. Okay, so click on the laser pointer again, press tab, and I'm going to click face select mode, and I just want to click the top face of my laser pointer right there, and you want to go to mesh, and you want to go snap cursor to selected, and that'll move the 3D cursor to the top face of the laser pointer. Now press tab to exit edit mode and go object, set origin, origin to 3D cursor. So now, once I've selected the laser, if I press R to rotate, you can see it rotates about this point here, which means we can have the other end of the laser pointer always pointing towards the empty, and then it will sort of follow this circular path. Okay, and then just go object, snap, cursor to world origin, so it moves it back to the original origin coordinates. Now I'm just going to press G and Z to move my laser up a little bit. So let's just move it up to Z equals 1.5. So the bottom of the laser pointer is sitting right on the floor there. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is to add a constraint so that the bottom of the laser pointer always points towards the empty. So we can go over here and sorry, so go to constraint, and we want to add a damped track, and we want the target to be our empty. Now you just need to make sure that you select the right axis, which I believe is -Z, and there you go. So you can see it doesn't quite make it all the way to the ground plane, so let's just extend out the length of the laser a bit. So if you just go to edit mode with tab, click on that bottom, make sure you go to local coordinates, and then you can just use this median transform just to drag out the length of the laser pointer so that it goes all the way to the ground plane. Doesn't matter if it goes a little bit further. Okay, so we've got our constraint added here. Now if you press animation and play, you can see the laser is always following that empty, so it's sweeping out a circular path. Okay, so the next thing, let's just set up some of our Eevee settings. So let's go to our render tab here. Want to make sure your render engine's set to Eevee. We want bloom, because that'll make the laser glow a little bit, because we're going to be using an emission shader on it. We want some screen space reflections, because we might add sort of a reflective material to the ground plane. We definitely want to add some motion blur. And let's just go into our screen space reflections. Let's turn off half res trace, and I think that's probably all. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's start adding a few materials. So let's select the laser. In fact, I'm going to rename cylinder to laser up here, just so I know what it is. I'm going to go to my materials tab and press new, and I'm going to go change this from surface, which is the principled BSDF shader. I'm going to change that to emission, and I'm going to give the laser a red color, and I'm just going to drag up this window here, and I'm going to change it to a shader editor and switch to rendered mode. So I'm just going to set the strength, let's try 200. And you can see we get this nice glow effect around the laser. Let's add some materials for the ground plane. So click on the ground, let's change plane actually, rename that to ground. Let's go new, and we'll leave it on the principled BSDF here, but I'm going to add a noise texture. So go Shift A, S for search, and type noise. Let's just connect the fraction to the roughness, and go Shift A, S, and let's just add a texture coordinates, and let's connect the object to the vector. And again, it's always good practice just to normalize out these scales when you're doing things materials and texture coordinates. So let's press Control A and select scale, and that's now brought the scales all the way back to 1. And you can sort of start to see that that noise texture on the roughness there. Now I'm just going to change the base color. Let's bring that down so it's more of a black color. Let's increase the metallic level. And that looks okay for now. So in the animation, you can see that the laser starts off at one point, rotates in a full circle, comes back, and then the laser turns off once it reaches its initial point. So we're going to want to control the strength of the laser at different points. So let's just go to go back to a timeline editor, and let's bring the simulation all the way back to frame 0. And I'm just going to select here, and let's have a look at the overhead view. So you can see the laser starts in this straight up direction, and if we scrub through the timeline, you can see it rotate around, and then it reaches the first point again at let's say frame 126. So let's go back one frame to frame 125, and you can see here we've got the strength value for our laser set at 200. So let's press I on that to add a keyframe. Then if we go to the next frame, frame 126, we want to set the laser strength to 0, so the laser turns off at that point once it's finished cutting a hole in the ground. So let's go back, let's go to rendered view, and let's play and see what it looks like. See, it does a full sweep, and then it reaches the point and it turns itself off. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is to add a source of particles for our sparks. And we want to place it at the position that the laser is intersecting the ground. So just press Shift A, Mesh. Let's add an icosphere, I reckon, as our particle source. Let's set the scale down to 0.01. Let's see if that's too small. Maybe a little bit smaller actually. Let's add 0.005. And that's probably okay. So I am going to select my icosphere. I'm going to go Control and select Empty, and then go Object, Snap, Selection to Active. And that will move my particle source, my icosphere, to the point at the end of the laser. And then I'm just going to go to a side view here, and I'm just going to scale it down a little bit more so it's about the same size as the laser. So let's bring that down so it fits just inside the laser now. And let's scale it down a little bit more and press GZ and bring it to a point just above the ground plane. Let's just have a look at that from a side view. And in wireframe mode, so I just press Z and click wireframe, and it's not quite sitting above the ground plane, I think. So that's probably okay. You can change it to however you like. But that's at about the right position. Okay, so now let's rename icosphere to particle source. And I want to parent the particle source to the empty, so the particle source follows the same circular path as the laser. So select the particle source, click on the empty, and press Control P and set parent to object. So now if you maximize out the empty, you can see the particle source is sitting in this hierarchy. And if I play the animation, the empty follows around with the particle source follows the empty object. Okay, so let's now set up some of our particle properties. So click the particle source, go to your particle source properties here, press plus to add a new particle source, and let's just set up some of the timing first. So like the laser, we want the particles to start at frame 1 and end at frame, let's say frame 125. So frame start 1, frame end 125. And let's increase the number of sparks to, let's say, 3000. And we're going to want to have a object to act as our sparks. So I'm going to go Shift A, Mesh. Let's add a UV sphere and rename this to Spark. And let's just scale it down a little bit. Let's just say 0.10 and press Control A, just normalize the scale. And I'm just going to press G and just move it somewhere outside the simulation, so it's just hovering up there. And let's give it a material. So with the spark selected, press New Material, and we're going to want this to be an emission, and I reckon just make it an orange color, and let's increase the strength to something like 1000. Okay. Let's go back to our laser here. So let's click particle source, go back to our particle properties and go render as object, and instant object you want to select as your spark. So that'll instantiate the spark as our particles. And let's just press play and see what that looks like. And you can see the particles are coming out, but they're not colliding with the floor. So we need to fix that by clicking on the plane, going to physical properties and adding a collision object or modifier to our ground plane. So let's just restart the simulation and see what that looks like now. And you can see they're sort of scattering along the ground now, but they're sliding everywhere. So we want to change some of those settings. So I found settings of 0.10 for the damping, works quite well, and a value of 0.05 for for the friction works quite well. Let's have a look at that. Probably still not quite enough. Let's increase the friction to 0.15 and let's have a look at that. Maybe a little bit more, 0.25. That's looking better. Let's just go back to our particle source and let's change some of these settings. So I found a lifetime value of 75 works quite well. Let's increase the randomness, lifetime randomness to 0.50. And let's go down here to velocity and let's change some of these initial velocity settings. So I found a normal velocity of 0.20, a tangential velocity of 0.20. We want the sparks to sort of bounce out of the floor a little bit, so I'm going to give it an initial Z velocity of 0.40 and randomize this to, let's say, 0.18. And let's have a look at what the simulation looks like now. And that's looking pretty reasonable. Let's just go to rendered view. And you can see it's making a really nice cut in the floor. Actually, that's quite a cool effect there. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is to create a hole in the floor. And we want to animate the cutting of the hole. So let's create a cylinder. So go Shift A, Mesh, Cylinder. And we want the radius to be 1. So the total diameter is 2. So it fits perfectly in our cylindrical path of the laser. Let's just decrease the depth and let's say set that to, actually we're going to be wanting to use this cylinder to cut a hole in the initial ground plane, so let's just set this to 0.2 should do okay for now, and let's just increase 50 should be okay. Okay, and right click on it and go shade smooth. But you can see you get this weird looking effect here, but you can fix that by going over to your vertices here, or this tab is called Object Data Properties, and go Normals and go Auto Smooth. And you can see you've got a really nice smooth cylinder now. Okay, so what we're going to do is animate 2 different ground planes. So at the start of the simulation, we're going to have a perfectly intact floor, and then once the laser's finished cutting through the floor, we're going to have the initial ground plane disappear and we're going to have another ground plane appear that has a hole cut in it. So let's do that. So let's click on our ground plane here and let's call it ground start. And now I'm going to press Shift D to duplicate and I'm going to call this ground end. And let's just click this cylinder and we're going to call this floor. Let's just call it floor hole. And now I'm going to use this object. Let's hide ground start. And I'm going to cut a hole in the ground end using my floor hole object. So let's go over to modifier settings. We don't actually need the collision object. So let's just go to here and turn off collision. Then go back to the modifiers and go Boolean. And we are going to want to use difference, and object will be set to floor hole. And I found solver fast actually works better for this example. So let's leave it on that. And then if you go to wireframe, you can kind of see it's starting to cut the floor, and then just press this little down arrow and go apply. Now, if I turn off floor hole, there you go. We've got a hole in the floor. And you can actually right click on the ground end and go shade smooth and select auto smooth just to make a nice clean cut in the hole. Okay, so now we're going to want to change the visibility of these different objects at different frames. So let's turn on our ground start, turn off our ground end. Now we're going to want the ground start to be visible between frames 1 and the frame just before the laser turns off. which was frame 126, I think. Yep, so the laser's turned off. So let's go back to frame 125. Let's press this little object properties button, go down to visibility, and you can actually animate these show in viewports or show in renders property. So let's just press I on viewports, I on renders, just for frame 125. And then on the following frame, frame 126, we're going to want to turn off viewports and renders and go I and I to put keyframes there. And now you can see the viewport disappears at frame 126. Now let's do the opposite for the ground end. So let's turn those back on. Now, so on frame 125, we're actually going to want these to be invisible. So turn those off, press I while with the mouse cursor hovering over those to turn off the visibility. And then on frame 126, we want to turn them back on and press I again to keyframe those at that frame. And do exactly the same thing for the floor hole. So frame 125, turn them off, press I to add keyframes. Frame 126, turn them back on, and there you go. So you can't actually see it yet, but because the floor hole's covering it up. So let's bring that down a little bit. So press G and Z, and we want the floor to be just below where the particles are sitting there. So kind of like that. Actually, let's bring it up just a little bit more so it matches up with the hole in the ground there. And that looks pretty good now. So now let's select particle source and let's bake out the simulation. So go to our particle settings and go to cache and just go bake. So let's just run the simulation now and just see what it looks like. And you can see we've got a problem there. So let's just go back to the start, go back to frame 0, let's delete all bakes. And just run. So for some reason it's not colliding with the ground plane. Let's just delete the collision, turn it back on again. Let's just see what that does. Okay, that's better. Some weird bug there. So let's go back to our particle source and go to cache and just go bake out simulation for all the frames and see what that looks like. And that looks pretty good now. Yep, I'm pretty happy with that. Okay, so now we want the floor hole object, the cylinder, to fall through once the laser's finished cutting. So if you go up here to frame 126, and we want to add physics rigid body. Now, you want to change, let's go here. On frame 125, we don't want the hole to start falling through yet. Otherwise, the floor, the second ground floor, ground plane will appear, and there'll just be a hole in there, and it'll be missing the center of it. So if you go over here, turn off dynamic at frame 125, and keyframe it with I. Go to frame 126 and turn dynamic back on and keyframe it there. So that means the simulation will start at frame 125 and it will start falling. So let's just replay the simulation and check that's working. Laser's cutting and floor falls through. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. And then you've got some leftover particles once the laser's finished cutting. And just to make the simulation look a little more interesting, I'm going to have a really bright ground plane underneath. So once the floor's finished falling through, there's this weird glow effect underneath. So let's just press Mesh, Shift A, S, and then Plane. Let's scale it up a lot. Let's make it 100 meters again. Control A, Scale. And then press G, Z, and then you want to move this second ground plane just a little bit under the first one. So you can see I've separated them out here. And then go to Materials, New, Emission, and I'm going to leave it white, but I'm going to crank it up to say 200. And let's have a, oh, I haven't actually got a camera. Let's go Shift A and go Camera. And Shift and tilde. I just use this to position my camera a little bit. And you can, it's the normal W, A, S and D controls, and you can just sort of position the camera where you want it. So that looks pretty good. And press rendered view. And then you can see once the floor's fallen through, that might actually be a little bit bright. There's my plane. And let's drop that to 100 or 50 perhaps. Okay, so now when you run the simulation, so it cuts a hole in the floor, falls through, and there's this really bright object beneath, and that's looking pretty cool now. Let's just change the ground plane material, the top one first, just a little bit more. So switch this back to the shader editor, and drop the specular a little bit. Increase, let's set the metallic to 90. Just drop the color a little bit. Oh, let's leave it about there. Increase the scale. And that's looking pretty good. Okay, so let's render out this animation now. So go to your, what's this? The output properties. I always just do two forward slashes. That just means it's going to render out to the same directory as the Blender file. File format, FFmpeg video, encoding, container, MPEG-4, and output quality to perceptual lossless. And let's go to frame 200. And I think we can leave everything else the same. Let's just switch back to the timeline and just see where the simulation should actually end. So the floor falls through, and then just give it a few more frames. So, I don't know, let's say frame 180. So let's go from frame 1 to frame 180. And then just save out the project. And just go back to frame 0 and go render. Let's go file, save, and render animation. And then we'll come back in a few minutes once this animation's finished. And it looks like the animation's finished now. So let's just see how it looks. And go, you can select render, view animation. And that's looking pretty cool. Pretty simple, but yeah, I think it looks fairly effective. I did have some issues with the sparks falling through at the end, so I just had to go back to my particle source, delete the bake, and then rebake the simulation, and it seemed to fix it. Thanks for watching this tutorial. If you like this tutorial, be sure to like the video, and please subscribe. Thanks again for watching, and see you next time.